Good afternoon and welcome to the first video in this series studying social and cultural change in the UK in the 1970s. This is only part of the course. This is the timeline part of the course, whereas in live class we were going over what it means to say that one is a cultural historian, what cultural history is, and the background of cultural history going right back to its founding fathers, if you like, and up through the 20th century with Keith Thomas and E.P. Thompson and such like people. So what I'm going to be looking at in this series is the 1970s in the UK and how to understand them, how to write their history. It's not very long ago. It's a long way. It's a long way back for some of you, but there's still plenty of witnesses around to tell us what they think, and so you've got all this huge amount of documentation, newspapers, television programs, and so on. Huge amount of people who lived through it, and a large number of books that have been written about it. So, what can we say about social and cultural history? What does that mean to talk about social and cultural change in the UK in the 1970s? And I was saying in my previous live class, I was saying that people think they know a lot about the 60s, the 60s, that time when everything changed, and the black movement in the United States, and the movement against the Vietnam War, and the alleged sexual liberation, and the introduction of the possibility in Britain of easy access to contraception, the legalization of abortion, the decriminalization of homosexuality. The 60s, we think we know what it is. So what is the 70s? What is the image of the 70s if you look at it? And how would that affect social and cultural change? How can we have a portrait of the 1970s? Even is it possible to do so? So this is a timeline. We're going to go through some of the social and cultural events, episodes, and changes in the 1970s from this point of view of what is it to write the history, and what can be linked to what. Now, it's possible to find approaches to this in many places. There are history books. There are also nostalgia books. Not quite history books about the 1970s, which are meant to appeal to old people like me who remember the 1970s, and nevertheless are meant to try to transmit some of the feeling of the time. There's this old zeitgeist question, very difficult question. What is the feeling of the time? How can you, people often read a novel, they say, it really gives you the feeling of this particular time, this particular place, but that can be something very difficult to define. But there's certainly been quite a lot of attempts to look at elements of the history and the history of the feeling. For example, if you have a look on YouTube, there's been a series of, not particularly about the 1970s, but there's been a series of television series where the idea has been to take people from today and to make them live like they would have done in the past. And some of these have, they're very, very popular, and some of these have worked on the 1970s. So here you have Turn Back Time, The Family, 505 1970s. You can find it on YouTube if you're interested in this, where they've got a family from today and took them back to the 1970s. Now, of course, they haven't chosen just any family. They want a photogenic and noisy family because it makes good television. But nevertheless, these kind of programs are usually accompanied by fairly serious social historians and historians of food and historians of clothing and so on, and come up with some quite interesting things. There's another one there, Back in Time for Brixton. Now, this is a rather particular case. I think I mentioned it in one of my classes. I can't remember which one. That they had done a whole series of programs, Back in Time for Breakfast and Back in Time for Dinner. And they'd gone back to the 1900s, the 1910s, the 1920s, and made families eat and prepare the food from the time and played the games of the time. And this went quite well. But one of the difficulties they had, that when they were looking back at the 1910s and the 1920s, they always seemed to be looking at it from the point of view of white people in Britain. And of course, there were a lot of white people in Britain. And so they decided to do something a little different and to have a deliberate attempt to look at black history in Britain, but still from this point of view of privileging the experience, showing people what it felt like, going back in time. And so they called this Back in Time for Brixton, Brixton being a part of London with a lot of black people. And they took a black family, a black British family from today, and they made them live for, I don't know, a week in the way immigrants in the 1950s mostly lived, and then for a week in the way that black immigrants in the 1960s lived, and so on. And so there are elements of nostalgia and looking at everyday life in this, but there was also a serious historical intent. That's Back in Time for Brixton, also available on YouTube. Even more than the 1970s house, Electric Dreams, the Teasmade, and the Cortina car, to consumer items from the 1970s, which marked the decade. And finally, Back in Time for the Weekend, the 70s. So there's been obviously the fact that they've come back in different ways to this, so it shows that there's an audience for this. But I do recommend this because they're not just there to bring in audiences. They do have a serious element of historical reflection. But I'm going to begin by looking at the political history of the 1970s very briefly. Because this is the first kind of history that you're likely to find in your school textbook. Who was in government, the elections, the new laws, the economy. So that's the political history is still tremendously present, especially in schools. Whereas social and cultural history perhaps more present in museums and on the television. So I'm going to go through some of the main political changes before going back to 1971 and going through a whole series of social and cultural events. The idea is to perhaps identify what the difference between political history, social history, and cultural history is, and also see, what the links might be, because links are not automatic. What does the song Pineapple Pen tell you about modern international capitalism? Not an easy question to ask, to answer, but there are links, and we'll see what we can find there. As is often the case in history, this will be very much a question of opening up questions rather than closing them, and so it's a lot of the work, as is normal for a historian. A lot of the work is finding interesting questions. Now, as the 1970s got underway, there were a couple of events which marked 1970. First of all, the gentleman on the left, this is Edward Heath, who was the leader of the Conservative Party and who won the general election in 1970. Somewhat to people's surprise, I think. We had a Labour government from 1964 to 1970. And although this Labour government had not brought in the huge left-wing reforms of 1945, 1946, 1947, nationalising many industries, bringing in free doctors, free hospitals, setting up huge social housing programmes, and so on and so forth, what was all this collectively known under the name of the welfare state, although the 1964 to 70s certainly did not spend loads of money in these radical social measures, which had been the case earlier on. Nevertheless, they did make some very significant changes. The end of censorship in theatre, the decriminalisation of homosexuality between men over 21 years of age, the legalisation of abortion, the making available of contraception on a much wider scale, and a series of other reforms which did have a certain importance. In any case, as 1970 came into view, we were now 25 years into this post-war boom, or as they say in French, the Trente Glorieuses. And so it was quite an optimistic country, because nobody, I remember it was probably 1960. I can't remember, 1968, 1969, and my father left his job on Thursday because he was annoyed at the foreman, and he got another one on Monday. I'm like, don't try this today, it doesn't work. So in any case, somewhat to everybody's surprise, Edward Heath, the Conservative leader, won the elections and formed a Conservative government. Now, Edward Heath in himself was quite interesting, because he was one of the very first of Conservative prime ministers not to come from the upper class. In fact, he was a middle-class grammar school boy, so that is to say he had not gone to a private school. Remember, in Britain, private schools are extremely expensive, and only 7% of the population go there. And the reason that the Conservative Party had chosen this gentleman to be their leader is that on the other side, there was Harold Wilson of the Labour Party, who made quite an impression as, in inverted commas, the ordinary guy. He would always wear a rather worn-out raincoat and drive a very small car and smoke a pipe in public. And so he was very much, a people's man. And opposing him for a while was Alec Douglas Home, who was an aristocrat at the head of the Conservative Party. And so the Conservative Party seemed to decide that they needed somebody who was going to look more of a people's man, and Edward Heath became Prime Minister in 1970. Another, I can only take a couple of events every year, of course. Another event from 1970, it was the South African cricket tour. Perhaps you can imagine that the South African cricket team in 1970 had only white people in it, only white men in it, despite the fact that the large majority of South Africans are black, and therefore when they did a when they did a tour of Britain, the anti-racist movement decided that this was not acceptable, and they organised a series of actions under the slogan "Stop the 70 Tour," and indeed they did manage to stop it. So that was one of the symbols of 1970. For 1971, I've just chosen two graphics. First of all, you can see there a graph of trade union density in the United Kingdom from 1900 to 2000. And trade union density is the percentage of workers who are in trade unions. And so you can see at the beginning of the century, it begins around 10%, and at the end of the century, 2000 then, it's around 30%. But between that, there are lots of ups and downs. Trade members rise during the First World War because the unions were very successful in getting better things for their members, because the government was desperate to keep the factories moving. And again, a rise during the Second World War, high plateau in the 50s and 60s, and a big rise in the 70s before a decline back down to 30%. Okay, so this big rise in the 70s is an interesting aspect. Now, there's no secret to most of this. Generally, when unions win things, people join unions, and when unions lose things, people don't bother joining trade unions, to put it rather simply. And so this indeed was a time when trade unions were, for a while, winning. And you can see an example of this, because you have there the campaign against the Industrial Relations Bill and a rally in Hyde Park in 1971 then. And the Industrial Relations Bill, I don't want to give you a tremendous number of details, but it was a proposed law which would make life for trade union activity, and in particular strike action, much more difficult. And the trade unions were very unhappy with it, refused to cooperate. They would get support from the government if they joined a register, which they refused to do. And they managed to more or less paralyze the law, and which was then reversed by the subsequent Labour government. And so it will not be until the mid-late 80s that the new Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher will be able to bring in these tremendous restrictions on trade union activity. It's 1972, no doubt, which is the high point of trade union power in Britain for the whole century. And this was seen in the moment of a miners' strike, not the Great Miners' Strike. The Great Miners' Strike is 1984, but 1972, a miners' strike, a very solid miners' strike. The miners were the strongest trade union in Britain, partly because when it had been built back in the 1920s and before, having a good union could easily be a matter of life and death because the mines were extremely dangerous places. In any case, there was a miners' strike in 1972, and the miners attempted to stop a series of factories working because the last big one was the Saltley Gate Coke Works, which transformed the coal into coke, which is much more useful. And it seemed that if the factory stayed open, the miners would lose their strike. And if the factory was closed, the miners would win their strike. And the miners' leader went round the factories in Birmingham nearby and said to the car workers and the engineering workers, you know that if you were on strike, the miners would support you. So I demand that you support us and you come with us to close this factory. And they did that. So tremendous movement of solidarity. The factory was closed down. The government considered sending in the army, but decided not to. And this was really, as I say, the highest point of trade union power in Britain in the 20th century. And certainly the elite, and certainly within the Conservative Party, this was the moment when they realized that their very first priority was going to be to break union power. And it would take them 15 or 16 years, but they would be relatively successful. So big crisis, big social crisis. This was partly linked to the fact that the 30-year boom was just beginning to come to an end. And in the 50s and 60s, when workers went on strike, quite often they won quite quickly because the economy was going well. It wasn't so difficult to make profits. And so quite often the bosses would prefer to give the workers some of what they wanted. As the 70s came into view, it was not so easy for companies to make profits. And so when there was a strike, the management would be hardline too, and it would tend to block things up. The other huge political crisis in 1972 was Bloody Sunday, which is when a Catholic demonstration against discrimination in Londonderry was shot upon by the British Army, and a dozen or so young men were killed. And this, the Parliament discussed it and said, oh, well, the soldiers were firing in self-defense, and all the press said so too. And this was 30 years later, the government apologized, and even later, there was an official government report saying that the men who were killed were shot in the back, were not armed, and that it was completely unfair and horrific. But that was much later. At the time, this transformed the situation in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, there'd always been Republicans who wanted the North of Ireland to be united with the South as a united Ireland. And some of them said, well, we need to work through politics, demonstrations, petitions, elections. And some of them said, no, we need a military option. And they formed the Irish Republican Army. Now, the situation completely changed in 1972 because this debate, do we need military action or political action, completely changed because after 1972, the people who defended the military option won the debate because the political people said, what we need is petitions, elections and demonstrations. And the IRA people would say, we had a demonstration, they shot your children dead in front of your house. Because thousands of people saw the people being shot. This was in the estate where there were big council blocks. Thousands of people saw it. And so the easiest job in the world just after 1972, in 1972 was probably recruitment officer for the IRA. And this, of course, would be the beginning of a 30-year low-level civil war in Northern Ireland. If we jump to 1974, we see more of the social and industrial conflicts. And indeed, now in 1974, there were two elections in February and October, and both times the Labour Party won. And one of the things the Labour Party did, which was notable in 1974, was passing the Health and Safety at Work Act, and this reduced very much the number of accidents at work. It was an important moment. So the election in February, and again in October, and there you can see then the Labour Party winning. There had been more big strikes, another miners' strike, and Edward Heath, the Conservative Prime Minister, had run the election campaign under the slogan, who should run the country? And the answer of the people who voted was not you. He lost the election, although the Labour Party had a very small majority. Well, I'm pretty sure they were a minority government in February and a very small majority in October. So it was always a rather tricky to do everything that they wanted to do. So we got this change over. Now, there are elections in 1970. 2 elections in 1974 and 1 election in 1979. So that's 4 within a decade. And in general, in democratic countries, if you have more elections than usual, it's because there's some sort of crisis going on. Indeed, this was very much a political crisis year. The link here with the cultural is possibly that it being the end of the post-war boom, mass unemployment coming back in the 1970s, it being the end of the post-war boom, this end of a boom, beginning of a huge crisis, that changeover period seems to have been a time that was particularly appropriate for cultural creativity, that things changing, the old world disappearing, seemed to produce quite a lot of interesting artistic and musical portrayals. 1975 had a couple of landmark events. First of all, for the first time ever in Britain, a woman was elected leader of one of the major parties. Margaret Thatcher was elected leader of the Conservative Party in February 1975, and she belonged to the neoliberal wing of the Conservative Party, who were very much opposed to nationalisation, so in favour of privatisation. Tending to think that in social and educational and health areas, the private sector, the private market should have a bigger role, and public spending should be less than it was at the time. Now, this neoliberal wing had always existed within the Conservative Party, but it had been somewhat marginalised during the post-war boom, when it wasn't possible for the Conservative Party to win elections if they weren't going to spend a huge amount on the welfare state. But as and Thatcher, in her own terms, in the short term, was very successful, because 20 years later, remember when historians say in the short term, they mean 20 years. 20 years later, instead of saying the neoliberal wing, we used to say the Thatcherism. The word Thatcherism was invented, and I think it's fair to say that as the first woman Prime Minister of Britain, Margaret Thatcher was more successful in her own terms in becoming memorable than was the first woman Prime Minister in France. I'll leave you to think about that one. The other event in 1975 was a referendum on whether Britain should remain a member of the European Economic Community, which was the predecessor of the European Union, and which Britain had joined in 1970, along with Ireland, indeed. And what happened is that the Labour Party leader, Harold Wilson, was rather bothered about the European Economic Community membership, because it divided the Labour Party very much. They couldn't get to agree on it. And so the referendum was the idea for a solution. Let's let the people decide, and then the side which loses in the Labour Party will shut up for a few years, because they've all realised that they don't represent very much. And it was quite successful. I don't mean Britain's entry into the European Economic Community was successful. I mean that the referendum was very easily won by the stay in Europe, the stay in the European Economic Community, which was what Harold Wilson wanted. And there we were. And of course, it's simply tremendous irony of fate that 40 years later, it was the Conservative Party that was split on the same issue, and they decided again to hold a referendum, but it didn't work because the side which the Conservative leadership did not want, the Brexit side, won. So there's all tremendously. So that's something fascinating about this. But the other fascinating thing about the European referendums is that in 1970s there was a very solid left argument for not joining the European Economic Community. There were a very small number of members of the European Economic Community, and it was portrayed by the left as being a club for rich countries and somehow a betrayal of international solidarity to join them. Whereas 40 years later, the European Union was presented as a representative of internationalism. In April 1976, Harold Wilson resigned and was replaced by his deputy, James Callaghan. That's not Harold Wilson, that's a statue of him. And James Callaghan became Prime Minister for 3 years, and it was marked by a certain number of key events. One was the arrival of North Sea oil that they discovered a few years earlier. They discovered oil, a lot of oil, in the coast off Scotland. And in 1975, it began to be pumped out. Strangely enough, the 1970s governments mostly had to pay money to the North Sea oil initiative to get all the machines up and so on. And the money really began to come in the 1980s. So this was somewhat unfair in a way, because the 1980s governments got a lot of money from the taxes, whereas in fact it was the 1970s governments who had done all the investment. In 1976, the International Monetary Fund put pressure on the British government and insisted that they reduce spending on education and health, and they did. And this was very shocking to a lot of people because the Labour Party was known for spending more. 1976 was also the year of the Race Relations Act. This wasn't the very first Race Relations Act, and it was tremendously modest. They established a committee to examine cases of discrimination. It was a very, very small step forward, but at the time it was probably ahead of most countries in Europe. And finally, in 1978, is what has become known, which was called by some journalists a winter of discontent, and it's simply a whole series of public sector strikes against the Labour government. So what was surprising about this is that in general, the trade union leaders had considered the Labour Party to be their party and the Labour government to be their government. But as the Labour government began cutting back on education, on spending, on local government services and so on, the trade unions decided that it was necessary to strike, even though the Labour government was in office, and so that was a moment of renewed tension between trade unions and the Labour Party, despite the fact that the Labour Party had initially, at the very beginning of the 20th century, been set up by the trade unions. And here you have on the right some of the strikers, and on the left of this conservative newspaper talking about the chaos of the strikes in the winter of 1978 to 1979. Final political episode, then the election in May 1979, and this wasn't in any way one of the big mistakes people make when looking at history, is that because something happens, people assume it was inevitable. This is not the case at all. It seems that if the Labour government had decided to have an election in September or October 1978, they could easily have won. at this time, the government had the right to choose when the election was. They don't anymore. But because they waited till May 1979, it seems that the big strikes over the winter reduced the popularity of the Labour Party among the electorate and allowed then Margaret Thatcher to come in and build very slowly her big image as the Iron Lady, and you often hear it said that Margaret Thatcher never compromised. This is, of course, complete nonsense. All political leaders, even not in democracies, but especially in democracies, compromise all the time, because that's how they keep their party united, and that's how they keep political opposition sufficiently calm so that they don't get themselves thrown out of office too quickly. But you can see it was a bit of an epoch change, because for the next 18 years there will be a Conservative government, and it will be a Conservative government that brings in massive neoliberal reforms and very much weakens the trade unions, very much pushes forward methodological individualism, and takes down whole sections of the welfare state. This will be continued after these Conservative governments, so you get the situation that you have today, where, for example, pensions are very much in the private sector, and people are expected to save up for when they retire, rather than having some sort of a guaranteed system. And that has brought me to the end of this very short presentation of the political events of the 1970s. And next time, quite soon, I will get into the social and cultural events and changes in the UK in the 1970s. Thank you for listening.